been thinking a lot lately about empathy and evolution, particularly Darwinian evolution, but not exclusively, about selfishness and the selfish gene, about the history of our species and the history of biology itself and how things biology has had to do to survive, about morality more generally, and the relationship between these things, I suppose. And for me, I'm starting to think of it in terms of selfishness and selflessness, selfishness and selflessness. So I think I can probably find some things to think about if I think about it in those terms. But what I'm thinking about right now is the relationship between that selfishness, selflessness thing and genetics and Darwinian evolution. And it's really about selflessness and how it plays out in things like altruism and empathy. Because it seems to me there's two ways of explaining selflessness as it relates to genetics and Darwinian evolution. One is the way that if I understand it correctly, people like Frans de Waal, primatologist, and other biologists, including Dawkins himself, Richard Dawkins, how they talk about it, which is that selflessness, the ability to be empathic, the ability to carry out altruistic behaviour, is a product of our genetic inheritance. Frans de Waal mentioned that not only primates engage in altruistic behaviour, but even something like rats do it. Any kind of reasonably social organism will have some kind of repertoire of behaviour that's altruistic, and because it appears in organisms which are relatively simple, which we probably wouldn't consider to be conscious, and that we certainly wouldn't consider to have a conscience, because it appears in those organisms, it must be a product of Darwinian evolution. There must be some kind of genetic component, and so there's a relatively straightforward argument to be made for that. And in fact, I've heard that kind of argument used many times in atheist circles as a counter to the claim that if you're an atheist you can't have any grounding for morality. And so people will say, oh, there is a grounding for morality and it's found in genetics. And they point to, well, they don't point to a selfless gene, but they do point to the existence of altruistic behaviour in the wild, in animals, and that seems to be supported by a kind of biological, genetic, Darwinian understanding of where morality and selflessness might come from. Now, whether that's direct, whether there's like a gene for selflessness, or whether there's which is unlikely, of course, or whether more likely there's that certain genetic predispositions create the platform from which altruistic and empathic behaviour can be built. That's a different matter. But either way, the general model there is that selflessness comes from the same genetic origins as selfishness, as the same kind of claims for authority are made for it, the same claims for it, the reality of it as a feature are made, and that's the argument. The other argument, and I'm really not sure which side I'm on this one, probably a bit of both. The other argument is that selflessness is contra to natural selection. It's contra to evolution itself. It might even be contra to the whole biology living systems project. This is the kind of Katherine Hepburn version of morality. I think it's Katherine Hepburn. She's in The African Queen with Humphrey Bogart, and I can't remember the context, but there's a conversation where he's talking about human nature, and she, being this very upper class, prim and proper person, says something to the effect that nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are here to rise above. So there's the idea that certain kinds of behaviour, and I think in some cases altruistic, moral, empathic, selfless behaviour, is sometimes cast as that, as the as a rejection of the natural, of an escape from nature, as an abandonment of nature, of anything to do with that we don't have to be genetically determined anymore. And they're interesting, yeah. I mean, they're both really interesting explanations, and they both have different attractions. I'm assuming that the truth is either some combination of them both or something different entirely, which encompasses them both. But they feel different actually when I think about them. If I think that my selflessness, to the extent that I am selfless and I am capable of empathy and altruistic behaviour, if I think of that in terms of its genetic predetermination, that it's an evolved system that presumably came out of the needs of social mammals, then it feels less valuable somehow. You know what I mean? In the same way that I can escape, at least partially, my responsibility for selfish acts by putting them down to the actions of my evolved natural selfishness. In the same way, I'm forced to abandon my ownership of my own morality if I say it's got genetic origins. I mean, I know it doesn't make entirely make sense, but that's kind of how it feels. But of course, the opposite one, the escape from nature, the Katherine Hepburn hypothesis, if you like, is obviously just romanticism. Well, actually, I think Steven Pinker said something similar. I can't remember which of his books it's in, but he's talking about. What's he talking about? He's talking about about how sexual desire is built on the back of the need to reproduce. And Steven Pinker says he hasn't got children himself and he's no intention of having children. At least he said that when he wrote this particular book. And he says that if my DNA doesn't like it, it can jump in the lake. Which is the same kind of expression, you know what I mean? The idea that our DNA builds us to do a certain thing, be selfish, let's say. But if we choose to, we can kind of decide not to. We can exercise some equivalent of free will, it seems to be being implied there, and join Katherine Hepburn by rising above nature. I don't know what the solution is. I mean, they just feel a bit different when I think about them. As I say, that the outcome is probably some combination or some third option I haven't thought about. But I do think a lot of the discussion about empathy and about how empathy is discussed in relation to Darwinian evolution and genetics, the origin of the species, and what it is to be human, a lot of them fall one side or the other of that divide, really, and we attach ourselves to one or other of those narratives, I think.